wanted to switch gears and talk about something else that has been happening. The U.S. military recently conducted at least 3 drone strikes in your home country of Somalia. In the first attacks, they said targeting al-Shabaab fighters in Somalia since President Biden took office. Congressmember Omar, your family came to the U.S. as Somali refugees. You wrote a letter to President Biden requesting more information on these strikes. You said, quote, "It's critical that any military action must be part of a broader strategy focused on the security of the Somali people and the stability of the Somali state." Can you talk about what you understand why the U.S. bombed Somalia again?
So it's been really hard to get any concrete information that is really, that really answers any of the questions I put in to my letter. It was our understanding that this administration was going to take a step back. They were going to look at a holistic approach. They were going to reassess their drone program and their engagement with Somalia. And the fact that they just started up the drone program without doing any of those things and without communicating any of those things to us as members of Congress was really alarming. I mean, Somalia has faced instability. I fled civil war in the early 90s. And to this day, there is places in Somalia where it is still unsafe for people to live in. Al-Shabaab has, and terrorism in Somalia has caused lots of devastation, and it is abhorrent for them to continue to operate. And so I do, stand with the Somali government and our administration in fighting al-Shabaab. What I do not appreciate is for us to not have a holistic approach to both fighting al-Shabaab and creating stability and having policies that are going to create a long-term stable Somalia.
So speaking of Somalia, in your book, you so eloquently talk about your growing up, your first 8 years in Somalia. Talk about Somalia. Tell us, you know more than anyone, being in Congress, how little information most people understand about Africa unless they are from there. And then particularly Somalia, why you left, your experience as a refugee, which so informs what you do now, working on immigration rights. Talk about your family.
Well, my story is uniquely an American story, right? We have been known as a country of immigrants. There has been the arrival of immigrants for a really long time from different parts of the world. But we are now just seeing, Somali immigrants, and there's a lot that is not understood. And I thought it was really important for me to write this book and spend a lot of time telling people about the Somalia I grew up in, where, there was a lot of warmth. I had a really happy upbringing up to the age of 8. I grew up in a very loud, loving family where, we didn't really have any ideas of hierarchy. We were all allowed to have the freedom to express ourselves, to own our agency, and I grew up in a household and in a community where music and the arts and all of those things were very vibrant, and the tragedy of living in that, and then one day waking up and having, the kids that you played with in the streets now carry guns is something that most people don't know. And I wanted to give people an insight of what happens when a society is stable and it's not really nurturing that stability, how everything can disappear in a day, and how someone who had that happy upbringing finds herself in a refugee camp, missing 4 years of formal education, coming to the United States, getting that golden ticket and opportunity, and overcoming a lot of the challenges that continue to exist in this country for people who arrive without nothing, and what it means to now have that voice in Congress, bringing attention to all of those disparities that exist here and in countries like Somalia.
And if you could talk about, if you could respond to what's happening now on the African continent as it relates to COVID. Our first headline today is about the desperate plea of the World Health Organization head, saying there should not be, third shot boosters in the wealthiest countries in the world before 10% of all countries are vaccinated. We've talked several times to the head of the African CDC. If you can talk about the situation in Somalia as well, and whether you support Ghebreyesus's call, something that Jen Psaki, the White House spokesperson, said, if the FDA says we need third shot boosters, we'll go for them.
Yeah, so, when COVID began, there was a call to social distance. And I remember thinking about Somalia and other countries in Africa where social distancing would be a luxury, right? These are places that are sometimes overpopulated, where there are open markets, where people, don't have a lot of space to distance in the ways that it was being recommended. And they have fragile healthcare systems. There is lots of poverty. There is a lot of insecurity in all aspects of life. Many of these governments don't have the resources that it takes to be able to keep everyone safe. As you know, we've struggled here in the United States, and we are one of the countries that has the most resources in the world. And so I do think it is really important for us to recognize that our humanity is tied to one another. And as I waited to get vaccinated, because I thought it was important to have other people who are at risk be vaccinated before me. I'm finally vaccinated. My whole family is vaccinated here, but I do often think about my family in Somalia and what it means for them to have access to that vaccination. We led a global call to send vaccinations to countries like Somalia and other countries in Africa and around the world that desperately need these resources. And so I do hope that before we think about giving ourselves a boost, that we send those resources to people who are less fortunate than we are.
Let me ask you about the issue of refugees, your experience, and immigrant justice in the United States. Groups are now suing the Biden administration over its use of Title 42, that Trump-era policy that allows for the expedited deportation of asylum seekers arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border, citing so-called public health concerns during the pandemic. The Biden administration says it'll continue enforcing the policy, which could bar entry to hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers. Human Rights Watch says over 600,000 have been expelled from the U.S. under Title 42 since March of 2020, going back through Trump. The lawsuit was filed by the ACLU, Raices, and Oxfam, among other groups, which denounced Title 42 as cruel, illegal, and a violation of due process rights. Your thoughts, Congressmember Omar?
I think these, Trump-era policies that the administration chooses to keep in place are inhumane on a deep personal level. I got emotional just thinking about this right now, because a lot of the people that come to our border are, escaping desperate situations. And it's easy for people to judge. It's easy for people to, talk about what makes somebody come to the border until they find themselves there. And I think a lot about what would have happened if Kenya closed its borders to my family when we were fleeing, or chose to deport us back. Where would I have been today? And so for me, it is really important for this administration and for every single person in this country to realize that these policy choices have consequences. And, we have a moral imperative in this country to get our immigration policy right and make it a more humane system. We have the Citizenship Act, that we have been pushing for in Congress, that would stabilize the status of 11 million people in this country. We have been working so hard to try to come up with actual solutions to our immigration crisis. And it is disheartening that instead of people working with us to find a solution, that they do the easy thing that sometimes seems might win you political favor, might stop some headlines from being written, but chip away at your soul, knowing that you are turning people away who desperately need help and are coming to this country, knowing that we have been a country that welcomes people and provides opportunities for people.
I choked up reading your book, a part where you're in the refugee camp and you lose your beloved aunt. Was her name pronounced Foss? Can you tell us about her? And this goes to people waiting in refugee camps, waiting and waiting, and the devastating toll it can take.
Yeah. I think a part of my story that most people don't know, which has made me a really strong advocate for a lot of the young people who are coming, and has made me speak out in regards to family separation, is that I was separated from most of my family. My Aunt Foss was the one who was who brought me and three of my siblings along with us on that journey to escape Mogadishu as war reached on. And she was my everything. I owed my life to her. And life in a refugee camp is not an easy one. In the refugee camp Utanga that we were living in, malaria was devastating the camp and taking lives. And she ended up getting malaria and ended up losing her life. And there was no health care that we could provide for her. There was no way to save her life, and just to watch helplessly. And know that she wasn't going to make it, but to not just live with the fact that we were losing her, that she wasn't going to live anymore, but that we were losing someone who really our survival depended on in so many ways, was very hard. And writing, those chapters were very hard. Doing the audio tape for those chapters was very hard. Doing this interview is very hard, but it's not as hard as what people have still been experiencing. There are a lot of young people who I lived in that refugee camp with, who didn't get the opportunity to stabilize their lives. Once that camp closed, they were sent to another camp. And I went in 2011 when drought was devastating Somalia, and over 1 million people were at risk of dying from famine, to the Dadaab refugee camp, which is one of the largest refugee camps in Africa, if not in the world. And I saw some of the young people that I was in the camp with, some of the kids I played with, who were also adults and had children themselves in those camps, as I've had opportunities to fulfill my education and now become a member of Congress. And so I feel like I owe it to those people to speak up about the plight of refugees around the world, to seek justice for people who have experienced war, who haven't experienced a remedy, not just for their trauma, but everything that they have lost, and for people who are in this country who just want to have their humanity seen and want to be treated with dignity.
Congressmember Omar, speaking of the horror of losing lives unnecessarily, I wanted to pivot to your home state and to your city, Minneapolis, where police killed George Floyd, murdered him, prompting mass protests. Now local activists have gathered more than 22,000 signatures to place a measure on the ballot this November to vote on whether to abolish the city's police department and replace it with a new Department of Public Safety. But the city attached an explanatory note to the ballot initiative that organizers say is misleading partial description. They filed a lawsuit to stop the note from being placed on the ballot initiative, saying the city's trying to influence voters with subjective, selective language. You are one of the leaders of this community that has experienced so much trauma. Can you talk about your views on this and what you think would lead to a more just solution, not only in Minneapolis, but it is certainly a model for the whole country?
Yeah, well, first of all, in regards to the ballot measure and the tactics of those that want to keep the status quo in place, I say to them, we've dealt with that before in Minnesota in regards to ballot measures, and I believe that this one will also be met with the same fate as the other one. So I'm confident that we will prevail. We've had a very incompetent and brutal police department for a really long time, and to the rest of the country and the world, they saw what happened with George Floyd and might have thought this is a one-off situation. I remember witnessing my first police shooting as a teenager, where they put nearly 38 bullets into the body of a mentally ill man who was just released from an institution, who didn't speak a word of English, who couldn't respond to their commands, who was not of any imminent threat to have had his life taken in such a brutal and a shameful way. And so many of us have experienced those kind of killings in front of civilians far too often than we would like to have seen. So the fact that the Minneapolis Police Department can no longer exist the way it is one that is understood by the majority of us. And I believe in the fight that people have engaged in regards to trying to have a more just system for us, and will continue to support their effort.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Congressmember Ilhan Omar, Minnesota Congressmember representing the 5th Congressional District, from Mogadishu to Minneapolis. The paperback edition of her memoir has just been released. It's titled, "This is What America Looks Like: My Journey from Refugee to Congresswoman." Thanks so much, Congressmember Omar. Well, up next, we go to Lebanon, where security forces fired water cannons and tear gas at protesters, marking 1 year since the devastating explosion at the port of Beirut, killing hundreds, injuring thousands. Stay with us.